Terry,
Mark,
good
good to see
you.
you. Thank you very much. And we really appreciate your talk today.
You're most welcome, man.
Mark, as we said, welcome and thank you so much for coming to talk to us today. It's a real privilege to have you here. Had an interesting chat to your colleague Tosh recently, and he explained a bit about firefighting. But it appeared that there's a lot of fairly challenging situations that you deal with. Sure. And I'm sure that the average person who's seen you flying around or seen helicopter firefighting would love to know about that. What are some of the threats that you deal with, and how do you minimize that threat through the training or planning that you do at Leading Edge?
Thanks, Terry. Thanks for the opportunity to chat to you and your viewers. The firefighting profession in itself is multifaceted. You know, we are obviously helicopter pilots, and then we become Bambi bucket pilots, because it's no good that you can fly a helicopter well, but you can't put the water on the fire. So what we do is we first have to assure ourselves that we are up to the task. We traditionally, on the Hawk, we have the bucket a little over 100 foot below the helicopter. And on the Hueys, we're looking at 40 feet below the helicopter. So the threat there is obviously any obstacles that we might come across, where they are possibly wires, what we call widow makers, which traditionally are more to be found in the forested areas of the Lowveld, not so much as in the Cape, where trees have died or been struck by lightning, and they shed their foliage and their leaves, and they become like a light grey, incredibly hard tree, and hence the name the widow makers, where when you mix one of the hazards, probably our biggest hazard is the poor visibility, which is normally due to the smoke. Your vision and the horizon and everything else becomes a little bit blurred. And so I'd say that the smoke is probably one of our biggest hazards. And with that said, when you've got tall widow makers that are the same color as the smoke and standing typically 100 foot above the ground level, something to be watching.
So, Mark, how do you minimize that threat when you go out on a sortie? How would you make that as insignificant as possible?
Terry, what we do is we approach the fire, and the mindset that the pilot needs to have is you might have only a few fires, or you might have been doing this for years, but every single fire I've ever been to has had something a little different about it. So I tend to look at a fire as a living threat with the nasty character at times. And funny enough, sometimes the smaller fires, if you're not wide awake, can bite you quicker than the bigger fires. So having said that, and I think the reason behind that is that when you approach a fire, especially initial attack, which is our specialty, somebody calls a fire, we get deployed, and we're going to get there while the fire is small, is not to decide that we're going to punish this fire quickly and we're going to go home. You have to look really carefully at the big picture. So part of my situational awareness is I always say to guys, for that extra minute or two, before you actually deploy the bucket, orbit the fire if possible, and get the situation in your mind as to the lay of the land, where the wires are, where the greatest threat might be. Because bear in mind, when we go to fires, we normally low level, being in helicopters, and what we perceive to be the threat might not be. So how do you mitigate the threat is you first need to orbit the fire, do what we call a recce, and decide which is the flank or the head that needs the most attention, because it's pointless anchoring the fire and meanwhile the gentleman's house is burning down. So get the big picture. That's the first thing. Then in that, you've got to decide which and where the threats are. You've got to identify. You've got to look at the wind. You've got to look at the topography and obviously the wires and any obstacles on the ground. And with that frame of mind, you then deploy the bucket and you then get into the firefight with the big picture. So typically on a farm, depending on the nature of the fire, we might well actually douse the farmhouse and the edges of the farm with foam and water before we tackle the fire, because it might be that if the wind is strong, and it normally is, that you might have a catastrophe. So, and then you need to set up a pattern. If there are other aircraft with you, we normally a minimum of 2 helicopters, is to maintain a pattern in and around the fire and to speak as little as possible. Because every time you speak on the radio, you might be distracting the pilot. Typically, we lift a load every 2 to 3 minutes is the average, which means that every 2 to 3 minutes, you're going to be lifting, watching the bucket, ensuring that you have the correct amount of power and that you can escape with the load in a good direction.
You mentioned power there. So performance with a full bucket and an empty bucket must be substantially different.
It is.
How does that work, and how do you minimize that threat?
On arrival at the fire, the Huey carries 1,400 pounds of fuel. And typically, depending where the fire is, you would normally arrive at the fire with at least 1,200 pounds of fuel. So when you initially arrive at the fire, one of the factors that you need to be aware of is your density altitude factor. So typically Nelspruit, for example, is 2,850 foot above sea level. And if you fly for 20 minutes, you heading north, you're going to be at 5,000 feet. If you're flying westward, within 10 minutes, you're at 5,000 feet. And you have to bear that in mind. And as a result of that, our buckets can carry 1,200 liters, but we cinch them to 80%. You can always uncinch them and go the full load once you burn your fuel, but typically you're going to arrive at the fire rather heavy. The second thing to keep in mind on fires is you only know how the aircraft's going to perform and the way to and from the fire line after your first load. So your first load is going to be what decides as to whether you're going to run that line or have to change the line, and how the aircraft will react given the wind and the direction and the rotor effects of the wind. So very important.
You mentioned that smoke was there as well. So now when you're running in for the first time and you see the smoke, there's obviously a lot of obstructions inside the smoke. Is that a big threat to you guys?
It is a big threat. Flying into smoke would be similar to a whiteout situation where people hovering into and slowing into a snowy LZ can white out, much as you would with a red out if you're landing on a dusty area where you lose your orientation and you have every chance of having an accident. With smoke, you have to be extremely careful. Probably the most dangerous fire you can fly is a fire where there's a lot of smoke and a low overcast. The two merge, and I have found myself in the Otanika Mountains where I became trapped between the smoke and the low cloud and had to find my way out. And that's why it's so important when your initial attack is to work out your path to the fire line and your escape route. You might be dropping higher than on the first load than you would as the fire progresses, but you've got to establish a pattern where your aircraft and yourself are going to be in the safest environment. And there's another hazard that might come in. Let's suppose the water does not release. Let's suppose you have a malfunction. So you're still heavy. You've got 1,000 liters of in the bucket, and now the bucket doesn't release. You have to assume, much like flying a twin-engine aircraft, that one engine might fail. You always want to be on the safety side. And in a similar vein, in flying with a full bucket, your first load might not deploy. In other words, you might end up flying into a blind valley or an area that's going to be difficult to work out of. So all the more reason to keep a little more height, a little more speed, so you can, in fact, escape from that situation. It's very difficult to plan for it, but if you keep it in the back of your mind that this bucket might not deploy, give yourself the space.
So you're catering for the worst situation in your mind.
Yes.
And anything better than that is a bonus.
Correct. And then in the same vein, in approaching a fire, we had a fire this season at near Grabo, where when we arrived there, the fire was going at a big pace, a fast pace towards a winery and the vineyard. And the winery was clearly going to go down in flames because they had a conifer windbreak, which had also caught fire. I orbited the fire, picked up my first load. I did a second orbit to make sure if I got into the smoke that I had a good way and escape out of it, because it's not ideal, but I realized that if I don't put water on the head and the back of this winery, it's going to burn. So I was really cautious, set myself up, flew through the smoke just on the edge of it, enough that I could get the load in behind the winery, and I saw there was an immediate difference. And we then continued on, and actually the winery did not burn down, because otherwise we might have put the fire out, but those people would have lost their livelihoods. So then you have to balance it. Are we here to ensure that the winery continues on, or are we going to put our lives at risk and it's going to be fruitless? So what you got to do is you've got to weigh up every situation, and the more you do this, the more comfortable you become with prioritizing the target.
Mark, it must be very hot. Some the fires are on days when it's normally hot.
Yes.
And you in this helicopter doing really intense work for quite a long time. Physiologically, are there any effects that you experience doing a long firefight?
Definitely, Terry. If I go back to my early Air Force years, I was a chopper tech as a youngster. I was 20 years old when I qualified. And breakfast was a parade. If you did not have breakfast, you could actually be charged and not fined, but it was a serious offense. And in the same way with firefighting, when you get the call, particularly first light, you don't know where you're going to be going to initially, and you don't know how long you're going to be out there. So we always have what we call a go-to bag of snacks. We always carry water and things like Cokes. I don't like energy drinks, but Cokes and water, energy bars. And given that, let's say it's a 40-degree day, which is quite normal in the Cape, when you're in the helicopter, it's actually very warm as well. We wear Nomex flight suits, which are in themselves warm. And because we fly with the bubble door, which is to allow us to put our head and helmet out to do vertical reference work, your ventilation is not great. We've got a massive fan, but we don't get cool. The Hawk is different. The Hawk has a cooling fan inside of it. So you've got to look after yourself. Every 2 hours, you have to land to refuel, and we use that as a leg stretch and to take in water.
So you've got the threat and you've minimized it by planning and taking stuff with you. So pre-planning is essential to
absolutely
enhancing the safety.
Absolutely. You've got to look after yourself, and as an old marathon runner, you've got to keep fuel in the tank, and the tank is your tummy. You have to be hydrated. And the other thing, of course, is when you go out the night before, ensure that you have enough rest if you're on duty, because I think to do this sort of work with the pressure that we are under, you want to make sure you're rested. I wouldn't want to be a pilot with a hangover going out at first light, which can happen.
Yeah.
Fortunately, I've not had to do that. But yeah, you have to get enough rest. And in that, there's a rule where after 10 o'clock at night, no one can phone you for a first light. What happens there is you now cause a hazard, because when you get a call, as I've had last season at 12 o'clock by an ops manager saying, Mark, there's a fire and you're not responding to my WhatsApps. And I said to the guy, it's 2 minutes past midnight. What would you like me to do between now and 5 o'clock when it's light? He said, I just wanted you to know. And then you lie half awake, knowing you're going to be getting up in a couple of hours. So there you already have a risk, and you have not left the house. We all know the accident didn't start at the site.
Yeah.
There were a number of factors. So importantly, you physically rested. And I would say that you're reasonably fit. I jog not very fast anymore, but I like to jog. I like to look after myself. Make sure that you're in good shape, because if you're not in good shape, you're not going to plan properly, and the poor performance is going to follow that quite quickly.
Yeah. Mark, finally, this is some of the most stunning scenery I've ever seen with the mountains. You've mentioned wind and topography, but the interaction of those two threats, because fires, I'm sure, don't play ball and hang around where it's nice and flat. you end up in these valleys. So,
Mm.
what is how bad is that threat, and what is the best way of minimizing that in your planning and your thinking?
What I say to people, Terry, is use nature as much as you can to your advantage. So when you approach the fire, you've done the orbit and you've recce'd where you need to be. Have a look where the wind direction is, because the fact that the wind might be a southeaster, quite often on the bigger fires, you have microclimates where the heat of the fire will then change the wind direction. Always be aware of the wind, and the wind can be your friend. You can have a 60 knot fire and be effective, or you might have a 20 knot fire. And if you're not reading the wind right, or it becomes where you're on the rotor side, the leeward side of the mountain, you might well have to call it a day. And the rule of thumb is, are you safe? Number one. And secondly, are you being effective? And if one of those two cannot be answered, you're in the wrong place. You have to stand down, because it is just another fire. So you have to be disciplined. We do this work, we like to help people. There comes a time, and it has happened, where you have to call it a day. And it's about realizing your own limitations. And when there's more than one helicopter on the fire, it's not easy to say, guys, I'm standing down, but you have to listen to your gut feel, because that's actually is going to keep you going.
Mark, thanks so much. That's fascinating, and I'm sure everyone's going to be very interested to hear it. So
Sure.
Thanks for joining us. Thanks for allowing me to come and sit in this beautiful machine that belongs to Leading Edge and is in such magnificent condition. After
You're
how
most
many years
welcome.
of service? When was this built?
Terry, HLA was built in 1964, and she turned 60 last year. We've done about 3,300 hours with her, and she's as good as new.
Fantastic, Mark. Thank you so much.
Most welcome.
I really enjoyed that.